All right, joining me now, once again, here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show, is my good friend, Katie Klabusich. Katie is a writer and a blogger whose work can be found at katiespeak.com. She is also a regular contributor to the Hal Sparks Show. You can find her on Twitter at Katie_speak. Katie, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's good to be back.
All right, so Katie, you have a great new post up at your site calling out, how can I say it, the bad people who are doing bad things and have been doing them for quite some time. Tell us all about it.
Yeah, so that doesn't sound new, right? And that's part of the problem. I think we've gotten really anesthetized as a culture. Part of it's just because of the way campaigns are waged, and it always feels like we're in the middle of a campaign cycle. So this last one that ended in November after an eon of campaigning had a lot of crazy talk, right? Actual incumbents were talking about legitimate rape and redefining things and weird stuff that we never thought we'd hear out loud or outside of the dark, outside of, small campaign stops with donors. And so after a couple of years of that, I mean, arguably longer than that, but especially the last couple of years, we sort of stopped paying attention. And I think for some people, it's apathy, but for some people, it's just an attempt not to go crazy. You hear a lot of that and you get so frustrated and you feel paralyzed that you end up turning it off. And so you miss things when people are being, terrible people. It doesn't get noticed, especially at the state level. And so my last post was kind of an attempt to call that out. All 400 Americans have seen their legislature stop for the last 2 years because a representative from Indiana, Republican Mike Pence, decided he didn't want to fund Planned Parenthood anymore at the federal level. And so in February of 2011, as the budget was being discussed again, he added an amendment that would defund Planned Parenthood. And after this, we ended up with the debt ceiling that happened in August of that year, and all the kicking the can down the road led to the super fund we had in November and December, where all we heard about was the fiscal cliff, fiscal curb, whatever it was. And we still don't have a budget. We've passed a bunch of continuing resolutions, and because of that, all that ends up getting talked about is the budget, with one never getting passed, which means nothing ever actually gets done, because as much as I hate it, we need money to get things done.
No, absolutely, and I think that's a really great point that you're making. I mean, there's many great points you made there, Katie. You're on fire here. But no, the first one being that that I think is really important, and that there's a certain idea that when these crazy bastards are being constantly crazy, to a certain point you get numb to it, and you just don't even it's just like, oh, they said something horrible again, oh, they're trying to pass another horrible bill. And at a certain point, if you care about this stuff, but at a certain point you don't necessarily maybe find the shock and disgust that you need to feel, and you need to have that reaction to clamp it down, and because it's such a constant onslaught, and there's also, I think, a certain sense of some people who, maybe you live in a big city, you live in you lived in Chicago, now you're in Maryland, but you live in a blue area where you're generally around somewhat nice people for the most of the time that are fairly sane, and you maybe just don't even want to accept that half of this country are people who are, for the most part, out of their minds and are really, there's a lot of bad people in this country, is kind of what I'm trying to say.
Right. Well, we lose track of things that happen at the state level. When you and I were talking earlier before we went on air, we talked a lot about what happens in smaller levels of government, right? We all turn out for presidential elections, but we tend to ignore the midterms, and we tend especially to ignore local elections. And this is something that Republicans have been very good at for our whole lives. We're in our 30s. This started before we were born. They got good at putting Republicans on school boards and as the dog catcher, and sort of bringing them up and putting judges at lower levels so that they would be qualified to be appointed to appellate courts and the Supreme Court. They have what our mutual friend Lee Camp calls plans. The evil people have plans and PowerPoints and presentations, and they're paying attention to how evil is doing every day. And we don't. Your point about us generally being around pretty nice people who are trying to just sort of get by and do nice things for the people around us. We tend not to realize that in Mississippi, which is a large geographical state that only has one abortion clinic, the last TRAP law they passed, which is a law designed specifically to impose unnecessary regulations on abortion clinics, thus closing them down. Mississippi is about to lose their only abortion clinic. And we don't notice because we're in blue areas, but that affects millions of people, sort of in that flyover country that gets ignored.
Mm-hmm. Well, and your point that it's all connected is also greatly important. I mean, like, when you look at the chain reaction that came down from Mike Pence's stopping of that bill to try to defund Planned Parenthood. I mean, just the chain reaction because of that. Just think of how many, because of the how much the economy went down because of that that threat over the initial debt ceiling thing. People lost their jobs because of that. A lot of people, they're I mean, I don't know what the exact statistics are, but I think you could figure out there is a certain number of people that most likely lost their homes because of what Mike Pence did, in Congress right there in 2011.
Absolutely. And anybody who has a personal loan of any kind, so I'm talking to people who have student loans, mortgages, credit cards, all saw their interest rates go up, even if it was just a fraction, on a personal, individual level. That's still a great mass. Anytime the full faith and credit of the United States is risked, which is what happens when we say we're not going to raise the debt ceiling. As a sidetrack, your listeners are smart, so I'm sure they already know that the debt ceiling isn't raised to approve additional funding. It's raised to allow us to pay the bills that Congress has already run up. So anytime you threaten to not raise the debt ceiling and therefore not pay your bills as the United States of America, you're risking the full faith and credit, and that lowers our national credit rating, which is why you see your personal interest rates go up on everything. So, I mean, it's not. It sounds irritating and wonky in the budget, and everybody goes to sleep the second anybody starts talking about the budget. But this affected everybody's bills.